The year is 1917, and the freezing waters of the North Atlantic have become a vast, silent graveyard. Beneath the gray swells, a new form of terror stalks the lifelines of the British Empire, threatening to strangle an entire nation into submission within weeks. The German High Command has cast a desperate die, authorizing unrestricted submarine warfare in a gamble that prioritizes starvation over diplomacy. As merchant sailors scan the horizon for the dreaded feather of a periscope, and politicians in London stare at reports of dwindling food reserves, the outcome of the First World War shifts from the muddy trenches of France to the cold, merciless depths of the ocean. This is the story of how the German U-boat nearly won the war, the stubborn resistance of the British Admiralty, and the desperate race against time to innovate before the United Kingdom starved. Chapter 1: The Kaiser's Desperate Gamble. The winter of 1916, turning into 1917, was not merely a season of cold weather for the German Empire. It was a season of despair. History remembers this period as the turnip winter. The war had dragged on for 2.5 agonizing years, settling into a bloody stalemate of trenches and barbed wire that stretched across the European continent. But while the soldiers froze in the mud of the Western Front, the civilians back home in Berlin, Hamburg, and Munich were slowly starving. The British Royal Navy had successfully established a blockade of iron around the North Sea. It was a suffocating grip that cut off Germany from the global markets. Grain, fertilizer, and vital raw materials could not reach German ports. The German people were surviving on a meager diet of turnips, a vegetable previously reserved for livestock. The hunger was palpable, and the social unrest was growing. In the corridors of power in Berlin, the German leadership knew that time was running out. They were fighting a war on two fronts, but the third front, the home front, was beginning to crumble under the weight of hunger and deprivation. It is in this atmosphere of impending doom that the story of the submarine war takes its darkest turn. The German Empire found itself backed into a corner, and like a trapped animal, it looked for a way to strike back that would end the suffering instantly. The solution lay not in the trenches of France, but beneath the cold, gray waves of the Atlantic Ocean. The decision that would change the course of maritime history did not happen overnight. It was the result of a fierce, high-stakes political battle fought within the highest echelons of the German government. On one side stood the civilian government, led by Chancellor Theobald von Bethmann-Hollweg. On the other stood the military titans, Field Marshal Paul von Hindenburg and his aggressive partner, General Erich Ludendorff. Bethmann-Hollweg was a man of the old world, a statesman who understood the delicate balance of international diplomacy. For months, he had acted as the dam holding back the flood of unrestricted submarine warfare. His primary fear was the United States of America. He argued passionately that unleashing the U-boats against any and all shipping, including neutral vessels, would inevitably draw the Americans into the war. He saw the United States not as a distant neutral observer, but as a sleeping giant with industrial capacity that dwarfed the European powers. To Bethmann-Hollweg, bringing America into the conflict was a death sentence for Germany. However, the military leadership viewed the situation through a different lens. Hindenburg and Ludendorff, the heroes of the Eastern Front, had effectively taken control of the German war effort. To them, the war could not be won by diplomacy or caution. It could only be won by decisive, brutal action. They looked at the stalemate on land and realized they did not have the manpower to break the Allied lines. They needed a weapon that could bypass the trenches and strike at the heart of the British Empire. That weapon was the U-boat. The catalyst for this fateful decision came in the form of a document that was as chilling as it was precise. It became known as the Holzendorf Memorandum. Admiral Henning von Holzendorf was the chief of the Imperial Naval Staff, and he presented a plan that seduced the military leadership with the allure of mathematical certainty. Holzendorf did not offer vague promises of victory. He offered a calculation. He argued that the British war effort was entirely dependent on shipping. Britain was an island nation that needed to import food to feed its people and raw materials to feed its factories. Holzendorf ran the numbers. He estimated that if the German U-boat fleet was unleashed without restriction, they could sink 600,000 tons of Allied shipping every single month. The admiral laid out a timeline that was incredibly specific. He argued that if this rate of sinking could be maintained, neutral shipping would be scared off the seas and Britain's supply lines would collapse. He predicted that within 5 months, by the time the summer harvest was due, Britain would be forced to capitulate. They would be starved into surrender, just as they were trying to starve Germany. The memorandum addressed the American problem with a dismissive arrogance that seems staggering in hindsight. Holzendorf and the military staff acknowledged that unrestricted warfare would likely bring the United States into the war. But they calculated that it simply would not matter. They believed the war would be over before the Americans could mobilize. They looked at the Atlantic Ocean not as a bridge for American troops, but as a barrier. Even if America declared war, they argued, they had no large standing army to send immediately. And even if they raised an army, the U-boats would sink the transport ships before they ever reached the shores of Europe. Holzendorf famously promised the Kaiser that not one American soldier would ever set foot on the European continent. It was a gamble of epic proportions based on the cold logic of tonnage and sinking rates. The climax of this internal struggle took place on January 9, 1917. The setting was the Castle of Pless, a grand estate in Silesia that served as the headquarters for the German Supreme Army Command. The atmosphere in the conference room was heavy with tension. Outside, the snow covered the grounds. Inside, the future of the world was being decided. Kaiser Wilhelm II sat at the head of the table. The emperor was a man known for his bluster and his instability, but on this day he was caught between two irresistible forces. On one side was his chancellor, Bethmann Hollweg, looking tired and defeated. The chancellor had run out of arguments. The misery of the turnip winter had sapped his political capital. The people demanded action, and the army promised victory. On the other side sat Hindenburg and Ludendorff, flanked by Admiral Holzendorf. They presented a united front. They told the Kaiser that the army could no longer guarantee victory on the Western Front without the help of the Navy. They framed the decision as a military necessity. They argued that the U-boat was the only tool left in the box. To refuse to use it was to accept defeat. The debate was sharp but brief. Bethmann Hollweg tried one last time to warn of the American danger. He spoke of the long-term consequences of the moral stain on Germany and of the industrial might of the United States. But Ludendorff cut him off. The general declared that America was militarily insignificant. He stated that he did not care about the neutral countries. He cared only about breaking the British blockade and ending the war. The pressure on the Kaiser was immense. He was terrified of losing the support of his generals. He was terrified of the hunger riots in his cities. He looked at the figures provided by Holzendorf. The promise of victory in 5 months. It was a siren song he could not resist. With a heavy heart, or perhaps with a desperate hope, the Kaiser sided with the military. He signed the order. Unrestricted submarine warfare would commence on February 1st, 1917. The term unrestricted is important to understand in its full horror. Previous to this, there were rules of engagement known as the cruiser rules. A submarine was supposed to surface, warn a merchant ship, allow the crew to abandon ship into lifeboats, and only then sink the vessel. This was a gentlemanly way of fighting that belonged to a previous century. It was dangerous for the submarines, which were frail and easily sunk by armed merchant ships. The new order stripped away all these protections. From February 1st onward, German U-boats were authorized to torpedo any ship they saw in the designated war zone around the British Isles. There would be no warning. There would be no surfacing. A torpedo would simply streak out of the darkness and tear the bottom out of a vessel, whether it was a troop transport, a cargo ship carrying grain, or a neutral liner carrying passengers. Every ship was now a target. The Atlantic Ocean was to become a free fire zone. When Bethmann Hollweg left the meeting at Pless, he reportedly said to a colleague that Germany was now finished. He knew that the gamble would fail. He knew that sinking 600,000 tons a month might hurt Britain, but it would enrage the world. He understood what the generals did not, that sinking ships was not just a matter of logistics, but a matter of politics. However, the orders went out. Through the encrypted radio channels of the German Navy, The message was relayed to the U-boat bases in Wilhelmshaven, Kiel, and the occupied ports of Bruges in Belgium. The U-boat commanders, young men in their 20s and 30s, received the news with grim satisfaction. For years, they had fought with one hand tied behind their backs. They had watched targets sail by because of political restrictions. They had risked their lives surfacing to warn ships that would then try to ram them or fire upon them. Now the leash was off. The German naval machine began to coil its spring. U-boats were fueled and loaded with torpedoes. Provisions were stocked. The crews were briefed on the new parameters of their mission. They were told that they were the saviors of the fatherland. They were told that their torpedoes would bring Britain to its knees before the autumn leaves fell. As January 1917 drew to a close, the Atlantic Ocean appeared calm on the surface. Merchant ships from America, Norway, and Brazil steamed toward Liverpool and London, unaware that the rules of the game had just changed. Captains of tramp steamers and great ocean liners looked at the horizon and worried about storms and navigation, not knowing that beneath the waves, a fleet of steel predators was moving into position, authorized to kill without warning. The German leadership in Berlin had rolled the dice. They had bet the entire existence of their empire on the calculation of tonnage and time. They believed that terror at sea would lead to peace on land. It was a decision born of desperation, fueled by arrogance and executed with cold precision. On January 31st, the German ambassador in Washington, Count Johann von Bernstorff, formally notified the United States government of the new policy. The note was polite, diplomatic, and devastating. It stated that starting the next day, all sea traffic within the zone around Great Britain, France, and Italy would be prevented by all weapons. The reaction in the White House was one of shock and betrayal. President Woodrow Wilson had campaigned on keeping America out of the war. He had tried to act as a peacemaker. Now Germany had slapped away the hand of diplomacy. The Kaiser's desperate gamble had begun. The stage was set for the deadliest month the oceans had ever seen. The U-boats were at their stations. The periscopes were raised. The torpedo tubes were flooded. The theoretical math of the Holzendorf Memorandum was about to be tested against the reality of steel, fire, and freezing water. The rise of submarine warfare in the Atlantic had truly begun, and the world would never be the same again. Chapter 2: Life of the Iron Coffins. While the politicians in Washington and Berlin debated the morality of unrestricted warfare, the men charged with carrying out this grim duty were living in a reality that few land dwellers could comprehend. Far removed from the mahogany desks of the White House and the gilded palaces of the Kaiser, the German U-boat crews were fighting a war of survival against the elements long before they ever sighted an enemy ship. To understand the devastation that was about to unfold in the Atlantic, one must first understand the machine that delivered it and the men who lived inside it. The German U-boat of 1917 was a marvel of engineering. Yet, for the 40 or so men crammed inside its pressure hull, it was a steel purgatory. These vessels were not the spacious, nuclear-powered giants of the modern age. They were narrow, primitive tubes packed with sensitive machinery, explosives, and human bodies. From the moment the hatch was secured and the submarine slipped away from the docks at Wilhelmshaven or Kiel, the crew entered a world of sensory assault. The first thing that hit a new sailor was the smell. It was a thick, inescapable stench that permeated every fiber of clothing and every pore of skin. It was a nauseating cocktail of diesel oil, bilge water, mold, rotting food, and the sweat of unwashed men. There were no showers aboard a World War I submarine. Fresh water was a luxury reserved strictly for drinking and for the batteries. For weeks on end, the crew lived in the same grease-stained leather uniforms, their bodies accumulating the grime of the machine. The air was heavy and stagnant, often laced with the fumes of the heavy oil engines and the lingering smoke of cheap cigarettes, which were the sailors' only comfort. Ventilation was poor when on the surface and non-existent when submerged. As the voyage continued, the atmosphere inside the boat grew steadily worse. When the U-boat dove to avoid detection or weather a storm, the temperature would drop rapidly. The steel hull, surrounded by the freezing waters of the North Atlantic, turned the interior into an icebox. Condensation, which the sailors called the sweating of the boat, would form on the cold metal walls and overhead pipes. It dripped relentlessly onto bunks, charts, and food. The dampness was absolute. Bread turned to soggy mush within days. Leather grew a fuzzy coat of green mold. The bedding was perpetually clammy. Many sailors suffered from rheumatism and severe skin rashes caused by the constant exposure to diesel fuel and damp clothing. Space was the other great enemy. Every cubic inch of the U-boat was utilized for war. There was no privacy. The captain alone might have a curtain to separate his tiny bunk from the passageway, but the rest of the crew lived on top of one another. In the forward torpedo room, crewmen slept in hammocks or bunks slung directly over the spare torpedoes. These polished steel cylinders, packed with high explosives, were their roommates. As the torpedoes were fired during the patrol, the crew would gain a little more living space, but until then, they slept cheek by jowl with death. The concept of hot bunking was standard practice. Since there were not enough bunks for the entire crew, men shared the same sleeping space. As one watch went on duty, they would climb out of the warm indentation left by their body, and a tired sailor coming off shift would climb immediately in. The sheets were never changed during the patrol. In this claustrophobic environment, tensions could flare in an instant. The psychological strain was immense. They called it Blechkohler or tin can madness. It was a form of cabin fever unique to the submariner, born of confinement, bad air, and the constant crushing pressure of the ocean outside. Yet these crews were the elite of the Imperial German Navy. They were technicians operating at the very edge of human endurance. To keep a U-boat fighting required constant vigilance. The boat was a complex beast of valves, levers, and gauges. When running on the surface, the U-boat was powered by massive diesel engines. These engines were deafening, filling the aft section of the boat with a roar that made conversation impossible. The vibration rattled teeth and loosened rivets. But the diesels needed air to breathe, which meant the U-boat had to remain on the surface to recharge its batteries and cover long distances. This is a crucial detail often forgotten in the lore of submarine warfare. The U-boats of 1917 were essentially surface ships that had the temporary ability to submerge. They spent most of their time above the waves, exposed to the weather and the enemy. Life on the bridge during a North Atlantic winter was a test of sheer physical fortitude. The lookouts, lashed to the conning tower to prevent being washed overboard by crashing waves, would scan the horizon through salt-crusted binoculars. Freezing spray turned their leather coats into stiff armor of ice. They stood watch for 4 hours at a time, their eyes burning from the wind, knowing that a single moment of inattention could mean the destruction of their boat by a British destroyer. When a target was spotted, the nature of the U-boat changed. It transformed from a surface raider into a silent predator. If the target was unarmed or a small merchant vessel, the captain might choose not to submerge at all. Torpedoes were expensive, technically complex, and limited in number. A standard U-boat might carry only a dozen of these underwater missiles. To conserve them, the Germans preferred to use the deck gun. The 88mm or 105mm cannon mounted forward of the conning tower was the workhorse of the U-boat war. The crew would scramble out of the hatches, man the gun, and fire warning shots to stop a merchant ship. If the ship stopped, the U-boat would send a boarding party to sink it with explosives or simply shell it until it slipped beneath the waves. This was the preferred method, brutal but efficient. It allowed the commander to save his precious torpedoes for high-value targets like troop transports or warships. But the introduction of unrestricted submarine warfare and the arming of merchant ships changed this dynamic. Surfacing was becoming suicidal. If a merchant ship carried a hidden gun, or if a destroyer was lurking over the horizon, the U-boat was incredibly vulnerable. Its hull was not armored like a battleship. A single well-placed shell could puncture the pressure hull, preventing the boat from diving and sealing the fate of the crew. Therefore, the submerged attack became the primary method of the new campaign. This required a level of mathematical and technical precision that was astounding for the time. The captain would observe the target through the periscope, a slender eye raised just inches above the waves. He had to estimate the enemy ship's speed, its range, and its course. Inside the conning tower, the navigator and the weapons officer would use slide rules and mechanical computers to calculate the firing solution. When the order to fire was given, the boat would shudder as the torpedo was expelled by a blast of compressed air. Then came the agonizing wait. The crew would stand in silence, counting the seconds on a stopwatch. They were blind, listening for the distant thud of an explosion. If it came, there was a brief moment of professional satisfaction, but rarely joy. These men were sailors, and they knew exactly what was happening inside the hull of the ship they had just doomed. However, the hunter could instantly become the hunted. The greatest fear of the U-boat sailor was the depth charge. In 1917, the British Royal Navy was beginning to master this terrifying countermeasure. When a U-boat was detected, it would crash dive, the alarm klaxons screaming through the boat. The diesel engines would be cut, and the quiet hum of the electric motors would take over. The boat would angle steeply downward, seeking the safety of the deep. Silence was their only shield. The crew would freeze. Men would remove their shoes to walk in stocking feet. Tools were set down on rags to prevent a metallic clink. They spoke in whispers. Above them, they could hear the churning propellers of the destroyers. To the ears of a trapped crew, the sound was like an express train roaring overhead. Then came the splash. It was a distinct sound, the heavy canisters hitting the water. The crew would brace themselves, grabbing onto pipes and handrails, staring at the ceiling as if their gaze could penetrate the steel. The explosion of a depth charge was a violent, physical blow. It was not just a noise, it was a shockwave. The lights would often shatter, plunging the boat into darkness. Cork insulation would rain down from the ceiling. Pipes would burst, spraying freezing seawater or high-pressure oil into the compartment. The hull would groan and creak, compressing under the twin assaults of the explosion and the water pressure. In these moments, the U-boat crew was helpless. They were trapped in an iron coffin, hundreds of feet below the surface, waiting to see if the rivets would hold. If the hull was breached, the end would be instantaneous and crushing. If the batteries were damaged and mixed with seawater, they would produce chlorine gas, a heavy green fog that would choke the crew in agonizing slow motion. This was the terror that sat in the back of every submariner's mind. It takes a specific type of person to endure this life. The crews were often young, many in their early 20s, yet they aged rapidly. Photographs of U-boat commanders from this era show men with hollow eyes and gaunt faces, looking decades older than their actual years. They were not the bloodthirsty pirates depicted in Allied propaganda. They were professional, patriotic, and often deeply conflicted men doing a job that required technical brilliance and nerves of steel. They were bound together by a camaraderie that existed nowhere else in the military. In the Army, an officer might be miles behind the front lines. On a battleship, the admiral sat high in a bridge tower. But on a U-boat, the captain ate the same moldy bread, breathed the same foul air, and faced the exact same probability of death as the lowest engine room stoker. They lived and died as a single organism. As February 1917 dawned, these crews were at their stations. They were patrolling the western approaches to Britain, the Mediterranean, and the North Sea. They had checked their torpedoes. They had fueled their engines. They were tired, they were dirty, and they were terrified, but they were ready. The order had been given. The restrictions were lifted. The theoretical calculations of the admirals in Berlin were now in the hands of these young men in their sweating, stinking steel tubes. They were the tip of the spear, and they were about to thrust it into the heart of the global order. The silent war was over. The total war had begun. Chapter 3. The Slaughter of the Innocents. The first day of February 1917 brought a cold and biting wind to the North Atlantic, but the temperature of the air was nothing compared to the chill that descended upon the hearts of Allied mariners. The previous rules of engagement, which had been frayed and battered for 2 years, were now completely discarded. The German High Command had declared the waters around Great Britain, France, and Italy to be a zone of death. Any ship found within these imaginary lines would be sunk. There would be no warning shots across the bow. There would be no boarding parties checking manifest papers. There would be no time granted for crews to lower lifeboats. There would only be the white trail of a torpedo and the sudden violent eruption of water and steel. The ocean, once a highway of commerce, had transformed overnight into a hunting ground where the hunters remained invisible. For the captains of merchant vessels, the horizon became a source of constant dread. Every breaking wave might hide a periscope. Every piece of floating debris might mask a conning tower. The vastness of the sea, usually a sailor's comfort, was now his greatest enemy because death could arrive from any direction, at any depth, at any moment. In the first week of February alone, the statistics began to tell a grim story. 35 ships were sent to the bottom. The sheer efficiency of the U-boat commanders was terrifying. They did not need to surface and expose themselves to gunfire from armed merchant cruisers. They simply calculated the speed of their target, fired their torpedoes, and vanished into the deep before the wreckage had even settled. The Atlantic was becoming a graveyard of iron and wood. The chaos in the shipping lanes was immediate. Ships from neutral nations, flying flags that were supposed to offer protection, found themselves in just as much danger as the British transport vessels. The German strategy relied on terror. They believed that if they made the ocean dangerous enough, neutral sailors would simply refuse to sail. They wanted to frighten the Norwegians, the Dutch, the Swedish, and the Americans into keeping their ships in port. If nothing moved, Britain would starve. This strategy of intimidation was brutally effective. In ports across the Americas and Scandinavia, crews walked off their ships. They refused to sign contracts. Cargo sat rotting on the docks in New York and Buenos Aires because no insurance company would cover the voyage, and no captain wanted to risk his life for a shipment of grain. The supply chain of the world was not just being broken, it was being frozen by fear. But for those who did sail, the consequences were horrific. One of the most galvanizing tragedies of this period occurred in late February involving the Cunard liner Laconia. This was not a military transport. It was a passenger ship, carrying civilians, mail, and general cargo from New York to Liverpool. On the night of February 25th, the Laconia was roughly 160 miles west of the Irish coast. It was dark, and the ship was running without lights to avoid detection, a ghost slipping through the black water. At around 10:30 in the evening, a German submarine, the U-50, spotted the silhouette of the liner. The captain of the U-boat did not ask for identification. He fired 2 torpedoes. The first struck the Laconia on the starboard side, tearing a massive hole in the engine room. The explosion shook the vessel from bow to stern, shattering glass and throwing passengers from their bunks. The scene that followed was a microcosm of the new war. There was no panic, but there was a terrifying, orderly confusion. The lights failed almost immediately as the dynamos flooded. In the pitch blackness of the tilting corridors, men and women fumbled for life jackets and felt their way toward the boat deck. The ship was listing heavily, making the lowering of lifeboats a treacherous operation. Some boats crashed against the side of the hull, splintering wood and spilling their occupants into the freezing swell. Among the passengers were 2 American women, Mary Hoy and her daughter Elizabeth. They were not soldiers. They were not munitions workers. They were simply travelers caught in the crossfire of a total war. They managed to get into a lifeboat, but the Atlantic in February is a cruel place. The water temperature was barely above freezing. The lifeboat took on water, leaving the survivors sitting waist deep in the icy slush. For hours they drifted in the dark, watching the great shape of the Laconia rear its stern into the air and slide beneath the waves. By the time a rescue ship arrived the next morning, both Mary and Elizabeth Hoy were dead from exposure. Their bodies were committed to the deep, but the news of their death traveled much further. When the story reached the United States, it ignited a fury that no diplomatic note could soothe. The death of innocent women, left to freeze in a waterlogged boat because of a torpedo fired without warning, stripped away the last illusions of civilized warfare. It proved to the world that the submarine campaign was not a blockade. It was a slaughter. Throughout February and into March, these scenes repeated themselves with sickening regularity. The loss of tonnage was staggering. In February, the Germans sank over 500,000 tons of Allied and neutral shipping. In March, that number climbed even higher. The U-boats were sinking ships faster than the shipyards of the world could build them. It was a mathematical equation of destruction, and the Allies were losing. The impact on the crews who survived the initial explosions was often just as deadly as the torpedo itself. The Germans were sinking ships far out in the Atlantic, hundreds of miles from land. Sailors who scrambled into lifeboats faced days, sometimes weeks, of drifting. They faced gale-force winds that capsized their small crafts. They faced thirst that drove men to madness. They faced frostbite that turned limbs black. There were reports of lifeboats being found weeks later with no living souls aboard, only frozen corpses huddled together for warmth that never came. In other instances, survivors told harrowing tales of U-boats surfacing among the wreckage. The German crews would sometimes emerge onto the deck of their submarine to inspect their kill. They would look down at the men struggling in the water or huddled in lifeboats. Sometimes they offered directions to the nearest land. Sometimes they took the captain prisoner. But mostly they simply buttoned their hatches and submerged again, leaving the survivors alone in the vast, indifferent ocean. This cold detachment terrified the merchant marine. It felt mechanical and inhuman. By March 1917, the strain began to tear at the fabric of the Allied war effort. The ports of Britain, usually bustling with the arrival of goods from around the empire, began to fall quiet. Warehouses that should have been stacked to the rafters with Canadian wheat, Argentine beef, and American ammunition were standing half empty. The disruption of the supply chain was not just about the ships that were sunk. It was about the inefficiency the panic caused. Ships were forced to take long, circuitous routes to avoid the main hunting grounds, adding days to their voyages and burning precious coal. Convoys were not yet fully implemented or understood, so ships sailed alone, vulnerable and slow. The turnaround time in ports increased because there were fewer ships available to move the same amount of cargo. This bottleneck at sea translated directly to hardship on land. In London, the price of bread began to rise. The government looked at the national stockpiles of grain and realized with horror that they were dwindling fast. At one point in March, it was estimated that Britain had only a few weeks of wheat supply left. If the U-boats continued their rate of destruction, there would be no bread for the civilians. But even more critical was the situation at the front lines. The armies in France relied on a constant stream of supplies across the English Channel. They needed shells for their artillery. They needed fodder for their horses. They needed coal to run the trains that moved the troops. Every ship that was torpedoed in the Atlantic meant that a shipment of copper or nitrates never arrived at the munitions factories in the Midlands. It meant that a factory had to slow down production. It meant that a battery of guns on the Western Front had to ration its fire. The submarine warfare was doing exactly what the German admirals had promised the Kaiser. It was bypassing the stalemate of the trenches and attacking the very lungs of the Allied war machine. They were strangling the enemy by cutting off the intake of resources. The British Admiralty was in a state of quiet desperation. They tried to hunt the submarines, but their methods were primitive. They used hydrophones that could barely distinguish between a U-boat engine and a school of fish. They laid minefields that the submarines often navigated with ease. They deployed Q-ships, heavily armed vessels disguised as helpless merchant tramp steamers, hoping to lure a U-boat to the surface. While the Q-ships achieved some heroic successes, they were a drop in the ocean compared to the scale of the problem. For every U-boat the British managed to sink or damage, the German shipyards were launching new ones, and the existing fleet was sinking dozens of merchant vessels. As March drew to a close, the situation looked bleak. The slaughter of the innocents, as some newspapers began to call it, was unchecked. The waters of the Atlantic were littered with the debris of a global economy being torn apart. Oil slicks, shattered lifeboats, and floating crates of cargo marked the spots where great ships had met their end. The psychological toll was immense. Every sailor who signed on for a voyage knew the statistics. They knew that 1 in 4 ships leaving British ports in March might not return, yet they sailed. They sailed because they had to, but the terror was always there, a cold companion standing watch on the bridge. The German High Command looked at the tonnage reports at the end of March and saw victory on the horizon. They had crossed the threshold. They were sinking over 600,000 tons a month. By their calculations, Britain would be on its knees before the summer harvest. They had gambled everything on this campaign, risking war with America to achieve it, and it appeared to be working. The supply lines were snapping. The shelves were emptying. The soldiers were looking over their shoulders, wondering if the shells would stop coming. However, in their ruthless calculation, the Germans had underestimated one factor. They measured success in tons of steel and bushels of wheat. They did not measure it in the hardening resolve of their enemies or the shifting tides of political will across the ocean. The sinking of the Laconia and the indiscriminate murder of neutral sailors had done more than just destroy cargo. It had begun to dismantle the patience of the United States. As the gray, storm-tossed month of March 1917 faded, the Atlantic was a scene of devastation. The U-boats were the masters of the sea. But the very success of their slaughter was about to trigger a reaction that would change the war and the world forever. The breaking point had been reached, and the silence of the American giant was about to end. Chapter 4, Bloody April. If the month of March had been a warning, April was the execution. As the calendar turned, the German High Command watched their strategic gamble unfold with grim satisfaction. They had bet their entire nation on the premise that they could starve Britain into submission before the American military could intervene. By the middle of April 1917, it did not look like a gamble anymore. It looked like a certainty. This period would go down in history simply as Bloody April. It was the month where the mathematics of war turned decisively against the Allies. The German U-boats, unleashed from all political constraints, descended upon the trade routes of the Atlantic with a ferocity that the world had never seen. The ocean, once a highway of commerce, became a graveyard of unprecedented scale. The statistical reality of the slaughter was difficult to comprehend, even for the men tracking the losses in Berlin and London. The German Admiralty had calculated that they needed to sink 600,000 tons of shipping per month to bring Britain to its knees. In April alone, they did not just meet this target, they shattered it. By the time the month was over, the U-boats had sent more than 860,000 tons of Allied shipping to the bottom of the sea. This number represented hundreds of ships. It represented a fleet that exceeded the entire merchant navy of many smaller nations, wiped out in a span of 30 days. On average, 13 ships were being sunk every single day. One ship was disappearing beneath the waves every 2 hours. The Atlantic had become a kill zone where survival was becoming a statistical anomaly rather than an expectation. The German tactics during this phase were ruthless and terrifyingly effective. While the coordinated radio-controlled wolf packs of the next World War were still a concept of the future, the U-boats of 1917 were operating with a unified purpose that felt just as overwhelming. They swarmed the western approaches, the funnel-shaped area of the Atlantic leading into the British Isles. They knew that every ship bound for Liverpool, Bristol, or London had to pass through these waters. The U-boats simply sat in these choke points and waited. For the merchant crews, the sea became a place of absolute terror. In previous years, there had been a semblance of rules. A submarine might surface and fire a warning shot, allowing the crew to abandon ship before the vessel was destroyed. Those days were gone. Under the rules of unrestricted submarine warfare, there were no warnings. A torpedo would strike without preamble, tearing through the steel hull and detonating in the engine room or the cargo hold. Ships often sank in minutes, taking their crews down with them before a distress signal could even be tapped out on the wireless. If a U-boat commander decided to save his precious torpedoes, he would surface only after determining the merchant ship was defenseless. The submarine would then use its deck gun to hammer the freighter into a burning wreck. The result was always the same: oil-slicked waters, floating debris, and open lifeboats drifting hundreds of miles from land, filled with freezing, traumatized survivors. In London, the atmosphere inside the Admiralty building shifted from concern to palpable panic. The British government, usually the picture of stoic resolve, was staring into the abyss. The man bearing the weight of this catastrophe was the First Sea Lord, Admiral John Jellicoe. Jellicoe was a brilliant naval officer, a man who had commanded the Grand Fleet at Jutland, but the submarine war was breaking him. Jellicoe sat in his office, surrounded by charts that told the story of an empire dying by slow strangulation. Every day, the pins on the map representing sunken ships multiplied. They clustered thick around the coast of Ireland and the entrance to the English Channel. It was a red tide of destruction that was closing off the British Isles from the rest of the world. During a secret and now famous meeting during this dark month, Jellicoe met with American Admiral William Sims, who had just arrived to coordinate the naval effort. Jellicoe did not attempt to hide the truth. He handed Sims a paper detailing the losses. The American admiral was stunned. He had not realized the situation was this dire. The press reports were heavily censored to prevent public hysteria, so the true scale of the disaster was known only to a select few. Jellicoe looked at Sims and admitted the impossible truth. He stated plainly that the Germans were winning. He calculated that if the losses continued at this rate, it would be impossible for Britain to continue the war past November of 1917. They were not looking at a stalemate or a negotiated peace. They were looking at total defeat within 7 months. The panic in the Admiralty was mirrored by a quiet desperation in the halls of the supply ministries. Britain was an island nation that relied on imports for survival. It needed steel and nitrates to make munitions, oil to fuel the Navy, and most critically, wheat to feed its people. By late April, the situation regarding food stocks was catastrophic. The Ministry of Food Control reported that the country had only 6 weeks of wheat supplies remaining. If the U-boats stopped the grain ships from North America and Argentina for just 1 more month, the bakeries would run dry. Bread, the staple of the British diet and the fuel of the working class, would disappear. The specter of starvation was no longer a theoretical threat used in propaganda posters. It was a rapidly approaching reality. The government began to draft plans for draconian rationing, fearing that food riots would break out in London and Manchester. If the people starved, the resolve to fight would crumble and the government would fall. The U-boats were not just sinking ships. They were sinking the social order of the United Kingdom. What made the situation even more agonizing was the total failure of British countermeasures. The Royal Navy, the most powerful maritime force the world had ever known, found itself utterly impotent against the submarine threat. They were fighting a new kind of war with outdated ideas. At this time, the primary method of anti-submarine warfare was the offensive patrol. The Admiralty believed that the best way to kill submarines was to send destroyers and auxiliary ships out to hunt for them. They scoured the ocean, looking for periscopes or the wake of a torpedo. But the ocean was simply too vast. A U-boat was a tiny speck in millions of square miles of water. It could submerge and vanish at will. Sending a destroyer to find a submarine in the open Atlantic was an exercise in futility. The British also relied on Q ships, heavily armed merchant vessels disguised as harmless freighters. In the early years of the war, these had been effective. They would lure a submarine to the surface, drop their disguise, and blast the U-boat with concealed guns. But the German captains had learned. They no longer surfaced to inspect neutral ships. They torpedoed them from beneath the waves. The Q ships, once the hunters, had become sitting ducks, blown apart without ever seeing their enemy. Desperation led to increasingly bizarre ideas. They tried mining the German harbors, but the minesweepers cleared the paths. They tried arming merchant ships with guns, but the untrained crews could rarely hit a small, low-profile submarine, and the weight of the guns reduced the cargo capacity. Nothing worked. The loss curves on Jellicoe's charts kept climbing. The psychological impact of this failure was profound. For centuries, the British people had believed that the Royal Navy guaranteed their safety. They believed that as long as Britannia ruled the waves, they were safe in their island fortress. Bloody April shattered that illusion. The Navy could not protect the merchant ships. The lifeline to the world was being cut, and the mightiest battleships in the fleet were powerless to stop it. The German strategy of unrestricted warfare was functioning exactly as predicted. They were trading diplomatic relations with America for the knockout blow against Britain. Even though the United States had declared war earlier in the month, the Germans were confident it would not matter. They believed the war would be over before the American army could be drafted, trained, and transported across the ocean. Looking at the carnage of April, their calculations seemed terrifyingly accurate. The shipping lanes were collapsing. Neutral shipping companies from Norway to the Netherlands began to keep their vessels in port. They refused to sail into the slaughterhouse of the North Atlantic. This effectively tightened the blockade even further. The British were losing not only their own ships, but access to the global merchant fleet that they relied upon to supplement their logistics. As April drew to a close, a sense of impending doom settled over the Allied High Command. The astonishing figure of 860,000 tons lost was not just a statistic. It was a death sentence. There was no way to build new ships fast enough to replace them. The shipyards were already working at maximum capacity, but for every new ship launched, 4 were being sunk. The Allies were losing the race against time. The U-boat commanders returned to their bases in Germany and Belgium as heroes, their pennants flying, painting the tonnage numbers on their conning towers. They were the victors of the Atlantic. They had brought the greatest empire on Earth to the brink of ruin. But in the depths of this disaster, facing the total collapse of the war effort, the British Admiralty was finally forced to confront its own stubbornness. The offensive patrols had failed. The Q-ships had failed. The mining had failed. There was only one option left. It was a strategy that the Admiralty had resisted for years, calling it defensive and un-British. It was a strategy that required a complete reorganization of global trade. It was the convoy system. As the sun set on the wreckage of bloody April, the decision was finally made. It was a choice born of absolute necessity. The independent sailing of merchant ships would end. The herds would be gathered together, and the destroyers would be pulled from their futile hunting patrols to act as shepherds. It was a desperate last-ditch gamble to save the starving island. The month of April had proven that the old world was dead. The question now was whether the Allies could adapt fast enough to survive the new one. The U-boats had done their worst, and they had nearly won the war. Now, the ocean was about to witness a fundamental shift in the nature of naval warfare, but for many, it felt as though the change had come too late. Chapter 5. The Admiralty's Blindness. To understand why thousands of sailors died in the freezing waters of the Atlantic during the spring of 1917, one must look away from the ocean and turn toward a stone building in London. This was the Admiralty. It was the brain of the Royal Navy, an institution steeped in centuries of victory and tradition. Within its high-ceilinged rooms and echoing corridors, men with gold braid on their cuffs made decisions that determined the fate of the empire. But in 1917, the Admiralty was not a place of clear-headed strategy. It was a place of paralysis. The refusal to adopt the convoy system stands as one of the most baffling chapters in naval history. To the modern observer, the solution seems obvious. If wolves are attacking the sheep, one gathers the sheep together and places guard dogs around them. Yet, the leadership of the Royal Navy viewed this simple logic with absolute disdain. Their blindness was not born of stupidity, but of a deep psychological barrier that they could not overcome. The senior officers of the British Navy were raised on the ghost of Horatio Nelson. They were educated in a tradition that valued the offensive above all else. To a British naval officer, warfare meant seeking out the enemy and destroying him in decisive battle. It meant aggressive patrols, hunting parties, and the roar of heavy guns. This was the spirit of Trafalgar. It was proactive, manly, and glorious. The concept of a convoy was the antithesis of this tradition. To the Admiralty, a convoy was a purely defensive measure. It was passive. It involved wrapping warships in cotton wool around slow, rusty merchant vessels and waiting for the enemy to strike. It felt like an admission of weakness. To Admiral Jellicoe, the first Sea Lord, and his staff, using destroyers to escort merchant ships was a misuse of naval power. They believed that warships should be hunting submarines, not babysitting freighters. This psychological fixation on offensive warfare led to a catastrophic misuse of resources. The Navy spent the early months of 1917 sending destroyers on independent patrols. They scoured the ocean, looking for periscopes in millions of square miles of empty water. It was a mathematical impossibility. A submarine was a speck in the vastness of the Atlantic. It could dive and vanish at will. Yet the Admiralty persisted, believing that if they just patrolled hard enough, they could sweep the seas clean. They were trying to find a needle in a haystack by moving the hay one stalk at a time, while the needle was busy puncturing the farmer's tires. When proponents of the convoy system tried to argue their case, the Admiralty produced a long list of reasons why it was impossible. These arguments were presented as hard facts, but they were largely based on prejudice and inaccurate assumptions. The first major argument was the fear of collision. The Admiralty painted a terrifying picture of what would happen if 30 or 40 merchant ships tried to sail in a tight formation. These were not precision naval vessels manned by disciplined crews. These were tramp steamers, cargo haulers, and tankers. Their engines were unreliable, and their turning circles were wide. The naval leadership argued that forcing these clumsy giants to sail in close proximity, particularly at night with no lights, would lead to disaster. They predicted that ships would crash into one another in the dark, sinking more tonnage through accidents than the Germans could ever hope to sink with torpedoes. This fear revealed a deep-seated class bias within the naval hierarchy. The Royal Navy officers generally looked down upon the merchant marine. They viewed merchant captains as undisciplined, independent-minded civilians who lacked the skill to perform complex maneuvers. They believed that a merchant skipper was incapable of keeping station in a zigzagging column. In the eyes of the Admiralty, the average merchant captain was barely competent enough to sail from port to port alone, let alone in a complex defensive formation surrounded by destroyers. The second argument against convoys was the belief that they presented a bigger target. The Admiralty logic suggested that a group of 30 ships would create a massive plume of smoke on the horizon, attracting every U-boat within 50 miles. They argued that by scattering the ships across the ocean, they diluted the target. They believed that safety lay in isolation. If a submarine found a convoy, they reasoned, it would be like a fox in a henhouse. The U-boat commander could fire his torpedoes into the mass of ships and hardly miss. This logic was statistically flawed, but the Admiralty refused to see the math. The ocean is vast. If 30 ships sail independently, a U-boat has 30 separate chances to spot smoke on the horizon. If those 30 ships are grouped together into one single formation, the U-boat has only one chance to spot them. The ocean is just as big, but the number of targets has been reduced from 30 to 1. Furthermore, if the U-boat did find the convoy, it would immediately face the guns and depth charges of the escorting destroyers. In the independent sailing system, the U-boat faced no opposition whatsoever. The final and perhaps most stubborn argument was the claim that there were simply not enough destroyers to go around. Admiral Jellicoe constantly lamented the shortage of escort vessels. He held on to the belief that every available destroyer had to be kept with the Grand Fleet, ready for a hypothetical second Battle of Jutland that would never come. He argued that stripping destroyers from the main battle fleet to protect commerce would leave Britain defenseless against the German high seas fleet. This scarcity, however, was an artificial problem created by the Admiralty's own bad math. The Operations Division had estimated the number of merchant ships arriving in British ports to be roughly 2,500 per week. Based on this massive number, they calculated that they would need hundreds of destroyers to escort them all, far more than the Navy possessed. But there was a flaw in the data. The Admiralty was counting every single arrival, including tiny coastal coasters, cross-channel ferries, and small fishing boats that did not require ocean-going escorts. The actual number of ocean-going merchant ships arriving from the Americas and the colonies, the ships that were actually vital to the war effort, was only about 140 per week. The Navy had plenty of destroyers to escort 140 ships. But because the senior leadership refused to look closely at the statistics, they continued to believe the task was impossible. As April 1917 dragged on and the tonnage losses mounted toward the catastrophic figure of 800,000 tons, the atmosphere in the Admiralty became one of despair. Admiral Jellicoe, a man who carried the weight of the war on his shoulders, became increasingly pessimistic. He told his colleagues that the war was lost. He saw no way to stop the bleeding. In his mind, the submarine was an invincible weapon, and the British Empire was doomed to starve. He was a man watching a house burn down while refusing to use the water hose because he was saving the water for a future drought. It took a politician to break the deadlock. David Lloyd George, the British Prime Minister, was not a naval man. He did not care about the traditions of Trafalgar or the sanctity of the offensive spirit. He cared about survival. He looked at the reports of sinking ships and rising food prices, and he realized that the experts were wrong. Lloyd George had been receiving back-channel information from younger, more flexible minds within the naval establishment, including Commander Reginald Henderson, who had identified the statistical error regarding ship arrivals. The Prime Minister began to pressure the First Sea Lord. He demanded to know why convoys were not being tried. The Admiralty pushed back. They flooded the Prime Minister with technical objections, jargon, and dire warnings of collisions and port congestion. They tried to intimidate the civilian leader with their professional authority. They essentially told him to leave the war at sea to the professionals. But Lloyd George was a master of political maneuvering. He decided to play a card that the Admiralty could not ignore. He announced that he would pay a personal visit to the Admiralty on April 30th. This was unprecedented. Prime ministers did not simply walk into the operational headquarters of the Navy and take the captain's chair. The implication of his visit was clear. If the Navy could not find a solution, the Prime Minister would come down there sit at the desk, and find one himself. He was threatening to impose a solution from the outside. This threat sent a shockwave through the naval leadership. The idea of a civilian politician dictating naval tactics was abhorrent to them. It was a humiliation they could not abide. Suddenly, the impossible became possible. Just days before the Prime Minister's scheduled arrival, the Admiralty's resistance collapsed. It was a face-saving measure. They could not be seen to be forced into action by a politician. They had to make it look like it was their decision all along. On April 26th, the division responsible for anti-submarine warfare, led by Rear Admiral Alexander Duff, submitted a minute to Admiral Jellicoe. In it, Duff completely reversed his previous position. He admitted that the situation was critical and that perhaps a trial convoy system could be attempted. It was a sudden, jarring U-turn. After months of arguing that convoys were suicide, the Admiralty suddenly decided that they were worth a try. Jellicoe approved the measure. The order went out. The first experimental convoys would be organized from Gibraltar. It was a tentative, hesitant step. They were still skeptical. They still believed the merchant captains would crash into each other. They still believed the ports would be clogged. But the political gun was held to their heads, and they had no other choice. The psychological dam had finally broken. It had not broken because of a sudden flash of tactical brilliance, nor because the admirals had suddenly realized the error of their ways. It broke because the horrifying reality of the death toll and the brute force of political intervention had left them with nowhere to hide. The Admiralty had spent the war looking for a glorious, offensive solution to the submarine problem. They wanted to hunt the wolf. But the nature of war had changed. Technology had shifted the balance. The solution was not to hunt the wolf, but to herd the sheep. It was a lesson that had been delayed by pride, tradition, and stubbornness. And the price of that delay was written in the manifests of hundreds of sunken ships and the letters sent to the families of thousands of drowned sailors. As the first experimental convoy gathered in Gibraltar in May 1917, the officers on the escorting destroyers watched the merchant ships form up. They watched them maneuver. To the surprise of the skeptics in London, the merchant captains did not crash. They kept their stations. They followed the zigzag patterns. They sailed in the dark without lights, moving as a single, dark entity across the dangerous ocean. The Admiralty had been wrong about everything. They had been wrong about the number of ships. They had been wrong about the skill of the merchant sailors. They had been wrong about the collision risks. And, most importantly, they had been wrong about the fundamental nature of the war they were fighting. The blindness of the Admiralty was lifted not by their own vision, but by the sheer necessity of survival. The convoy system was born in an atmosphere of reluctance and pessimism, pushed forward by a prime minister who refused to accept defeat. The iron grip of the offensive mindset was finally loosened. But as the system began to take shape, the question remained, was it too late? The U-boats had devastated the global shipping tonnage. Britain's reserves of wheat were down to just 6 weeks. The convoy system was the right cure, but the patient was already on death's door. The race was no longer about strategy. It was about time. The ships were gathering, the destroyers were taking their positions, and the Atlantic was about to become the stage for the greatest logistical experiment in the history of warfare. Chapter 6: The Yanks and the Destroyers. The Atlantic Ocean was a vast, gray graveyard in the spring of 1917. While the British Admiralty finally acquiesced to the concept of the convoy system, the clock was ticking with terrifying speed. The German High Command had made a calculated gamble in January. They knew that resuming unrestricted submarine warfare would almost certainly drag the United States into the conflict. However, their admirals and strategists had run the numbers. They believed, with icy confidence, that their U-boats could strangle Great Britain into submission before the slow-moving American giant could mobilize its forces. They gambled that the Atlantic was too wide, and the American military too unprepared to make a difference in time. For a few harrowing months, it appeared the German calculation was correct. The United States declared war on April 6, 1917, but a declaration is not a fleet. The American Navy was substantial, but it was untested in modern European warfare and located thousands of miles away from the choke points where the merchant vessels were dying. The bridge across the Atlantic had to be built instantly, and the cornerstone of that bridge was a man named Admiral William Soden Sims. Sims was not a typical brass-bound officer. He was an innovator, a gunnery expert, and a known Anglophile who had previously gotten in trouble for voicing too much support for the British Empire. Washington selected him to travel to London in secret, even before the official declaration of war was finalized. He traveled incognito, wearing civilian clothes, listed on the passenger manifest as a generic traveler to avoid attracting the attention of German spies or submarine captains. His mission was to coordinate with the Royal Navy, but he had no idea of the catastrophe awaiting him. When Sims arrived in London, the city maintained a stiff upper lip. The buses ran, the shops were open, and the newspapers published managed reports of the war's progress. But when he walked through the doors of the Admiralty to meet with the First Sea Lord, Admiral John Jellicoe, the facade crumbled. Sims expected a briefing on a difficult struggle. What he received was a death sentence. Jellicoe, the man who had commanded the Grand Fleet at Jutland, looked aged and worn. In the privacy of his office, he handed the American admiral a classified paper. It contained the true figures of merchant shipping losses, numbers that had been rigorously hidden from the press and the public. Sims scanned the document. He saw the tonnage lost in February, then the spike in March, and the projected devastation for April, which was on track to exceed 800,000 tons. Sims looked up at Jellicoe, stunned. He famously remarked that it looked as though the Germans were winning the war. Jellicoe replied with quiet, devastating honesty. He told Sims that they were not merely losing, they were losing completely. Unless the losses could be stopped, Great Britain would be forced to surrender by November. The Empire had exhausted its ability to feed itself and fuel its war machine. There was no reserve left. This meeting changed the entire trajectory of the American naval effort. Washington had initially assumed their role would be to protect the American coastline and perhaps send battleships to join the Grand Fleet. Sims immediately realized that battleships were useless in this crisis. The war was not being fought by dreadnoughts in the North Sea. It was being fought by solitary merchant ships sinking in the western approaches. The specific antidote to the submarine was the destroyer. Destroyers were the greyhounds of the sea. They were fast, maneuverable, and, crucially, expendable enough to be risked in submarine waters. They carried depth charges and guns capable of sinking a U-boat on the surface. But the Royal Navy did not have enough of them. The Grand Fleet required a massive screen of destroyers to protect the capital ships at Scapa Flow, leaving the merchant lanes woefully exposed. If the convoy system was to function, it needed shepherds. It needed escorts to circle the herd. Sims began a frantic campaign of telegrams back to Washington. He bypassed diplomatic niceties. He told the Navy Department to drop everything and send every available destroyer, tug, and light craft to European waters immediately. He argued that the war would be won or lost in the Irish Sea and the western approaches. It was a hard sell. American admirals were naturally hesitant to strip their own coasts of protection to save a foreign power, but Sims was relentless. He made them understand that if Britain fell, the American coast would be the next frontier of the war. The response was the deployment of the 8th Destroyer Division. It was a modest force to tip the scales of a global conflict, consisting of only 6 ships: the Wadsworth, Conyngham, Porter, McDougal, Davis, and Wainwright. They were commanded by Commander Joseph Taussig. These ships were not prepared for a transatlantic deployment of this magnitude. They were designed for fleet actions, not long-range endurance runs. Their crews were young, many of them reservists or new recruits who had never seen the ocean, let alone a war zone. The journey across the Atlantic was a brutal awakening. The destroyers were battered by spring gales. They leaked. Their engines were pushed to the limit. The crews lived in a world of constant motion, wet clothes, and cold food. But they pressed on, driven by the urgency of Sims' reports. They were steaming toward Queenstown, located at Cobb on the southern coast of Ireland. This port sat right on the edge of the vital shipping lanes, the precise hunting ground where the U-boats were slaughtering the merchant fleet. On the morning of May 4th, 1917, a mist hung over the Irish coast. Standing on the headlands and the docks were crowds of locals and Royal Navy personnel. They were waiting for a sign. For weeks, rumors had swirled that the Yanks were coming, but in the fog of war, Hope was a dangerous thing to hold on to. Then, cutting through the haze, the sharp, narrow bows of the American destroyers appeared. They steamed in column formation, their flags snapping in the wind, their hulls stained with the salt and rust of the crossing. To the British, this was more than just a reinforcement. It was salvation. It was obtaining a new lease on life. The arrival was captured in a film reel that would be shown across the Allied world, titled The Return of the Mayflower. The symbolism was heavy and deliberate. The Pilgrims had left England for the New World to survive. Now the New World was returning to ensure England's survival. The destroyers docked, and Commander Taussig went ashore to report to the British Commander-in-Chief of the coast of Ireland, Vice Admiral Lewis Bailey. Bailey was a legendary figure, known for being stern, demanding, and notoriously difficult to please. He was a man who ate breakfast in silence and expected absolute perfection. He looked at the young American commander and the small, battered ships that had just crossed an ocean. Bailey expected them to need weeks of refitting and rest before they could be of any use. Bailey asked Taussig a simple, direct question: when would he and his ships be ready for sea? Taussig's reply became one of the most famous sentences in American naval history. He did not ask for shore leave. He did not ask for repairs. He looked at the British admiral and said, "We are ready now, sir. That is, as soon as we have completed our refueling." This attitude electrified the Queenstown command. It signaled the end of the hesitation that had plagued the Allied response. The American destroyers refueled and immediately went to work. They did not sit in port. They sailed out into the rough waters of the western approaches to hunt. The integration of the United States Navy into the theater was not just about numbers. It was about the operational freedom it provided. With these 6 ships, and the dozens that followed them in the coming weeks and months, the Royal Navy could finally breathe. They could release their own destroyers from patrol duties and assign them to the new convoys that were forming. The American ships took on the role of the Mosquito Fleet, buzzing around the slow merchant ships, forcing the U-boats to stay submerged. Life at the Queenstown station was grueling. The destroyers would go out for 5 or 6 days at a time, enduring Atlantic storms that rolled the narrow ships up to 45 degrees. Cooking was often impossible. Sleeping was a challenge of bracing oneself against the bulkheads. When they returned to port, they had only enough time to refuel, restock ammunition, and sleep for a few hours before heading back out. But the morale was high. For the first time in 1917, the hunters were being hunted. The presence of the American destroyers forced a change in German tactics. A U-boat commander could no longer surface and leisurely sink a merchant ship with his deck gun. If he surfaced, he risked being spotted by a patrolling American destroyer that would charge at full speed, firing its guns and dropping depth charges. This forced the submarines to use their precious limited supply of torpedoes while submerged, drastically reducing their efficiency and the duration of their patrols. Admiral Sims and the Queenstown Command had achieved the impossible. They had bridged the Atlantic not with paper treaties, but with steel hulls. The arrival of the destroyers made the convoy system mathematically viable. Before May 1917, there simply weren't enough escorts to protect the groups of merchant ships. Now, the screen was forming. The German High Command watched with growing horror. Their gamble was failing. The Americans had not been delayed. They had not been paralyzed by bureaucracy. They had sprinted across the ocean and plugged the hole in the Allied dike. The sheer psychological impact of seeing the stars and stripes flying in British waters cannot be overstated. It told the merchant sailors that they were no longer alone. It told the British public that the cavalry had arrived. As the summer of 1917 approached, the waters of the Atlantic were still dangerous. Men were still dying in the freezing cold. But the dynamic had shifted. The U-boat was no longer the undisputed master of the sea. It now had a predator stalking it. The convoy system, fueled by American destroyers and British organization, was about to undergo its first major tests. The experiment was live. The question was no longer whether the convoys could be formed, but whether they could hold the line against the desperate fury of the German submarine fleet. The return of the Mayflower had brought the tools. Now came the work of survival. Chapter 7: The Hunter Becomes the Hunted. The Atlantic Ocean is a place of vast, terrifying emptiness. For 3 years, that emptiness had been the greatest ally of the German U-boat commander. He could roam the shipping lanes, surfacing at his leisure to recharge his batteries, hunting solitary merchant ships that sailed alone and unprotected. The ocean was a hunting ground where the prey was scattered and the predator was invisible. But as May 1917 turned into June, the view through the German periscopes began to change. The horizon, once dotted with the smoke of vulnerable steamers, was becoming disturbingly empty. The hunter was losing his easy targets, and the dynamics of the war at sea were undergoing a fundamental reversal. The implementation of the convoy system was not merely a defensive measure. It was an aggressive restructuring of maritime geography. By gathering merchant ships into tight formations, the Allies effectively emptied the ocean. A single ship sailing alone is a speck in the vastness of the water, but 1,000 ships sailing alone provide 1,000 chances for a submarine to stumble upon a victim. When those 1,000 ships are concentrated into 20 large groups, the mathematics of the hunt change entirely. A U-boat could patrol for weeks without seeing a wisp of smoke. The ocean suddenly seemed larger and more desolate to the German crews. When a U-boat captain finally did spot smoke on the horizon, he no longer found a helpless tramp steamer plodding along at 8 knots. He found a fortress. He saw columns of merchant vessels moving in disciplined rows, surrounded by a screening force of destroyers. These escorts were the sheepdogs of the sea, dashing back and forth, their crews alert, and their weapons primed. This concentration of shipping presented the German captain with a terrible dilemma. If he wanted to sink ships, he had to go where the destroyers were. He had to penetrate the defensive screen. To launch a torpedo, he had to reveal his position to the very warships designed to kill him. The convoy system forced the U-boat to come to the destroyers, rather than forcing the destroyers to search the entire ocean for the U-boat. This tactical shift marked the moment the hunter became the hunted. The psychological pressure inside the narrow iron hulls of the U-boats began to mount. In the early years of the war, a submarine could attack on the surface using its deck gun, saving precious torpedoes and allowing the crew to breathe fresh air. Now, the presence of escorts forced them to spend much of their patrol submerged, running on electric motors, conserving battery power, and breathing foul, recycled air. The invincibility of the submarine was being stripped away layer by layer. The change was not just organizational, it was technological. The summer and autumn of 1917 saw the introduction of weapons that turned the ocean depths into a place of terror for the submarine crews. The most significant of these was the depth charge. Before 1917, a destroyer had few ways to attack a submerged submarine. They could try to ram it if it was near the surface, or they could try to snag it with explosive sweeps, but these methods were clumsy and rarely effective. The depth charge changed everything. It looked unassuming. It was essentially a metal drum, resembling a Standard Oil barrel, packed with 300 pounds of high explosives. It was fitted with a hydrostatic pistol, a mechanism that detonated the charge not on impact, but when it reached a specific depth chosen by the destroyer crew. As the destroyers raced over the suspected position of a U-boat, sailors on the stern would roll these drums off the racks and into the ship's wake. For the men inside the U-boat, the experience of a depth charge attack was unlike anything in the history of naval warfare. First came the sound of the destroyer's propellers overhead, a churning, rhythmic thrashing that grew louder and louder until it passed directly above. Then, there was a momentary silence as the drums sank through the water column. The explosion, when it came, was not a sharp crack, but a massive, crushing hammer blow. The water transmitted the shock wave with perfect efficiency. Inside the submarine, the lights would shatter, plunging the crew into darkness. Cork insulation peeled off the walls. Pipe flanges groaned and burst, sending jets of high-pressure water screaming into the control room. The hull plates flexed and buckled under the strain. It was a form of psychological torture as much as physical destruction. A U-boat crew could do nothing but sit in the dark, silent and sweating, waiting for the next explosion, wondering if the rivets would hold for one more minute. The depth charge did not always need to hit the submarine directly to be effective. A near miss could jam the diving planes, damage the rudder, or crack the battery cells, filling the boat with deadly chlorine gas. It forced the U-boat to stay deep and stay quiet, effectively neutralizing it as a threat during the attack. To make matters worse for the Germans, the Allies were learning how to listen. The development of the hydrophone began to strip away the submarine's cloak of invisibility. These early listening devices were primitive, often consisting of microphones towed behind a ship or mounted on the hull. A trained operator, wearing heavy headphones, would strain to hear the telltale mechanical noises of a submarine beneath the waves. They learned to distinguish the rhythmic beat of a U-boat's electric motor from the biological crackle of shrimp or the movement of the water. This acoustic warfare added a new dimension to the cat-and-mouse game. If a U-boat moved too fast underwater, its propellers cavitated, creating noise that the hydrophones could pick up. This forced the German captains to creep along at dead slow speed, limiting their ability to maneuver into a firing position or escape after an attack. The ocean was no longer silent. It had ears. By September and October of 1917, the statistics began to tell the story of a failed strategy. The German High Command had gambled everything on the belief that they could starve Britain into submission before the American army could make a difference. They had calculated that they needed to sink 600,000 tons of shipping every month to break the British logistical spine. In April, they had far exceeded that, sinking over 800,000 tons. But as the convoys tightened their grip, the numbers plummeted. By November, shipping losses had dropped to less than 300,000 tons. The curve was bending in the wrong direction for Germany. The U-boats were working harder for diminishing returns. They were spending more time at sea, burning more fuel and facing more danger, yet they were sinking fewer ships. The convoys were arriving safely. The ports of Liverpool, Bristol, and London were bustling with activity. Wheat, steel, oil, and ammunition were flowing into Britain in a steady river of supply. The blockade had been broken, not by removing the submarines, but by rendering them ineffective. The failure of the German strategy became undeniable with the arrival of the American troop transports. This was the ultimate prize for any U-boat commander. A single transport ship carried thousands of enemy soldiers. Sinking one would be a devastating blow to Allied morale. Yet, the convoys protected these high-value targets with layers of steel and vigilance. The huge liners, converted into troop ships, moved fast, flanked by destroyers that zigzagged aggressively. The Leviathan, the Olympic, and other giants of the sea ferried the American Expeditionary Force across the Atlantic largely untouched. The German Navy had promised their Kaiser that not a single American soldier would set foot on the continent. By the end of 1917, hundreds of thousands of doughboys were training in France. The weather in the North Atlantic turned cruel as December arrived. Winter storms battered the convoys, making life miserable for the crews of the destroyers and merchant ships alike. Waves crashed over the bridges of the escorts, freezing into ice as soon as the water hit the metal. Keeping station in a convoy during a blizzard required superb seamanship and nerves of steel. Collisions were a constant risk. But despite the elements, the system held. The discipline of the Merchant Marine and the Royal Navy, reinforced by the fresh energy of the United States Navy, had created a bridge across the ocean that the U-boats could not collapse. The mood in the German submarine bases began to darken. The crews were exhausted. They were returning from patrols with tales of frustration, describing oceans that seemed empty until suddenly they were filled with rushing destroyers and exploding depth charges. The swagger of the early war years was gone, replaced by grim determination to survive. They were still dangerous, and they still claimed victims, but they were no longer the masters of the Atlantic. By the time 1917 drew to a close, the crisis had passed. The Allies had not destroyed the U-boat fleet. There were still many submarines prowling the waters. But they had achieved something more important. They had neutralized the strategic threat. They had proven that the submarine could be managed. The tonnage war, the cold calculation of sinking ships faster than they could be built, had been won by the Allies. The convoy system had saved Britain from starvation. The gamble of unrestricted submarine warfare had failed. It had brought the United States into the war, adding a massive industrial and military power to the enemy's side, without achieving the quick victory Germany needed. The submarine, once the ultimate weapon of blockade, had been reduced to a nuisance, a deadly, terrifying nuisance, but one that could no longer dictate the outcome of the war. As the new year approached, the focus of the naval war would shift again. The U-boats would try new tactics, moving closer to the coast, looking for weak spots in the armor. But the decisive moment had happened in the summer and autumn of 1917. The Atlantic was open. The bridge was secure. The hunter had been forced into the shadows, and the lifeline of democracy remained unbroken. The story of 1917 was the story of how the Allies looked into the abyss of defeat and built a system to bridge it, sailing through the danger together, column by column, until the tide was turned.